something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Peter Byrne, it's great to have you here.
Well, it's pretty good to be here too, Aaron.
You are the author of a new series of articles that is ongoing, and there's already 3 posted, at least as of the time that we're recording this. And the series of articles is called Military AI Watch, and you have published this with our friends over at Project Censored. You and I both know Mickey Huff and Peter Phillips, the esteemed Director Emeritus, we could say, of Project Censored. And you're writing about something that's timely. I mean, I just noticed that Glenn Greenwald had a couple segments on AI and some of these same Weasley characters that we're dealing with. So let's just maybe start with the question, and I'll put links to these articles in the show notes so that people can check them out, and I do recommend them. They're a good overview, and I expect that the rest of the series will be as good as well. But can you tell us how you got interested in the subject of AI, and what made you want to take a closer look at these strange tech oligarchs that are wielding so much power when it comes to this AI and surveillance and so on?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be able to start researching the subject of military AI. The series is called Military AI Watch. And I guess I started about 2 years ago. I do a lot of science writing as well as investigative reporting. So I think the unusualness of Military AI Watch is that it deals with the financial implications and structures of military AI as well as the technical. A lot of people just do one or the other. I've known the Project Censored people for 20 years. I have a high regard for them, and so I approached them with doing this 10-part series. It publishes once a month, a pretty deep dive into some aspect of military AI, and it's edited by Andy Lee Roth. They do a really bang-up job of presenting it, and best of all, they're not going to censor me. So it was, not the type of reporting that the New York Times would do, because they have people like Ezra Klein and Cade Metz who are just suck-ups to the, Silicon Valley structure and do nothing of any value. The stories have lots of links to source material. Some of them are technical science papers. Some of them are videos, corporate videos. They're pretty interesting. I suggest that people might want to follow some of those links. It also has a PDF version you can print out if you don't like to read on a screen, which I don't. And it has an audio version. It has me actually reading it. And I think it's a pretty good thing if you're driving to work or wherever to amuse yourself with all the horrors of military AI.
Were you tempted to use an AI reader and to save yourself the labor,
No.
or was there ever any question?
This stuff doesn't work. I make this point time and time again. AI is like so hyped and vastly incompetent that, I've got Microsoft Word and it has this little Copilot on it, and I've experimented with it. Sum up this like 200 page audit from the Department of Defense or something, and it does nothing of any value, because all it can do is basically sum up what the most repetitive points are in it. And the way that bureaucrats write, they keep saying the same things over and over again. This is what we're going to tell you, and then this is what we told you, and this is what we think. What it doesn't find is the contradictions. So as an investigator, I'm looking for contradictions. I'm looking for paradoxes, and it's incapable of finding that. Most people have no idea about what artificial intelligence is, sadly. Artificial intelligence, if we want to digress into this for a moment, is just computation. It's been around since, before World War II. The first artificial intelligent machine was actually the bomb sites that were on board the B-17 bombers that went over European cities and Japan, dropping bombs that caused firestorms and that were just as powerfully deadly as the atomic bomb, actually, in many instances. So after World War II, the whole idea of using computers for military purposes got a lot of funding. One of my heroes, actually, Norbert Weiner, who was a polymath, very famous. He was involved in some of the bomb site stuff during the war. He's an MIT professor who wrote about cybernetics and coined the word cybernetics, which means steersman in Greek. And he wrote a number of books that were really popular in the 1950s, in which he explained how computation worked very well. And he also had a social aspect to it. He was not definable as a radical of any sort, but his thinking was quite radical. And one of the points that he made about computation, especially for its use in the military and for the purposes of social discipline, was that it was like a golem. And in the Jewish cultural tradition, a golem is a creature made of mud and clay that is made in a humanoid form, and that it will do whatever you want. It's kill your enemies or get you lunch. But in order for it to be obedient, you have to write the word of God on a piece of paper, a shem, and put it in its mouth. And that causes it to be obedient. But if the shem falls out, it goes berserk and starts destroying everything. So the deal with computation and artificial intelligence is somewhere along the line, 40 years ago, somebody came up with this really advertising phrase, artificial intelligence. It's not intelligence, intelligent. It doesn't resemble the human brain or how our brain works at all. And the origins of military AI in computation were in what we call symbolic artificial intelligence, which is kind of rule-based. Programmers would anticipate any number of possibilities in a situation and write rules. So if X, then do B. If B, then do C. And that is called symbolic artificial intelligence. And that's the kind of basic computation that would rule until a few years ago when neural nets came along. Neural nets are not rule-based. They're probability mechanisms. Basically, what they do is if they sit on top of or trained with vast amounts of data. Most of the foundational AI models are trained with Wikipedia, Reddit, the Common Crawl, and internet garbage.
Right, it's just that's so bad because all of those things are Wikipedia is so manipulated on any controversial issue, like anything pertaining to U.S. imperialism, for example. It's really like it may as well be CIApedia. I mean, and so if they are going through treating that as gospel, and then Reddit's even more ridiculous. You just have all these anonymous people, and they will whatever they feel like writing about the most. They just can. If that's all you were looking at, you'd be talking about a totally alternative reality.
Well, the issue is that in order to use the neural nets, they had to have billions and actually trillions of what are called tokens. Tokens are words that are broken up into pieces like syllables, or images that are broken up into, like, if you have a cat, you got a cat's toenail on a cat's paw, a cat's leg. And the data is broken up into these tokens, and then it is ensconced in a kind of hyperspace where pieces of data will have proximity to each other. For instance, the toenail of the cat will have some proximity to the foot, and then to the entire, the eyeball and the face. And if you calculate, or the neural net calculates based on probability formulas, these probabilities of closeness of these images to each other, then you'll form up a whole cat. It's the same thing with the chats. The chats aren't like actually in a conversation with you. What they're doing is they're using your prompts to examine literally trillions of words to see which ones are the most similar, which ones are the closest in proximity to them in this kind of hyperspace, and then they combine them. And they do it really fast. They do it at light speed, right? So, people, it's been so anthropomorphized. People think that it's amazing, man. My computer's talking to me. It's like a stone started talking to you on a walk or something like that. And so you tend to believe it. It results in automation bias, where we give, credence to machines over ourselves. And what happened with the neural nets over the last, 10 or so years, but it keeps accelerating, is they've run out of data. The big companies, Apple and OpenAI, which is basically Microsoft, and the rest of them, they've used up the internet, and they've also experienced a problem in that, because so much AI generated slop is making its way back onto the internet, it's cannibalizing itself. They're training themselves on supposed data, which is AI slop, which was full of hallucinations and confabulations. That is the Achilles heel of neural net deep learning type of AI that we're faced with right now, is that it has no way of judging the truth or the falsehood of what it says. All it can judge is proximities of these tokens. So it comes up with absurdities. I asked ChatGPT some time ago what all my journalism awards were, and it came up and gave me the Pulitzer Prize and the Polk, which I never got, right? And it didn't get all the ones that I have gotten. So most people know that this is the problem, and it makes it very untrustworthy. So what they try to do, since the foundation models are trained on this vast corpus of internet data, they use that kind of programmatic foundation to train individual AI programs on smaller amounts of data, narrow fields of data. For instance, if Target wants to be able to predict what aisles are best for its customers to buy certain products, they can, use their cameras and their checkout counters and everything else to create a narrow database that then they can show the probabilities of a person wearing a hat, or a white person or a brown person coming into the store and going to what aisle at what time. Now, that's because they actually have some data that they can use to do that with. The problem with military AI is, especially when it's used to model nuclear exchanges, which it is, believe me, is that we don't have much data to train it with. So there's an effort, since we have vast surveillance mechanisms globally between satellites and drones and ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere, to feed this data into the foundation model so that we can, or the military, so it can train these models to be able to make reasonable arguments, to make logical connections between events, between finding people, between assessing weapons and their efficacy and stuff like that. But the problem with that is that so much of this data is streaming in real time that it's not really possible to capture it all and to make sense of it all. So the military has been using simulations for a long time, but it's even more so with the problems that are caused by the neural nets, simulations to train its war bots. And what it is trying to make is something called the Combined Joint All-Domain Awareness Command and Control System, the JDAC, which in theory will combine the electrons and photons streaming in from satellites and drones and cell towers and the Internet of Things, literally millions of devices around the world, which is enabled by 5G, which is another story that I've written about here in Military AI Watch, is to combine them into so that one general can sit in the Pentagon and go, oh, well, this is going on in Korea, we should do this, we should do that. And since the combat is going to be taking place at really rapidly, I'll let the AI decide when to, fire the bomb or stuff like that. Well, one of the problems with that is that as war games are showing, and this is the subject of my next installment in the series, which will be out the last Thursday of June, is that if you leave the management of the war games, and they do lots of them, to the AIs, they always end up in nuclear war because they don't know how to recognize when the other side is bluffing. They don't actually care if the world blows up, and the simulations that they're trained on are, a lot of them gaming products, like based on the Unreal Engine, shooter games, in which the premium is to kill. So that's why Hegseth and people like that are continually mouthing this new mantra about increasing the lethality of the American forces through AI, right? So the pipe dream they have is they can sit back in the Pentagon and let the autonomous weapons guided by this JDAC go out and defeat all their enemies. Of course, the enemy has a vote too, right? And as I explained in the last article in the series, which is about the electromagnetic spectrum, all of this has to take place in the electromagnetic spectrum. The data centers, which there's I think 6,000 of them in the world right now. They're in America, they're in Europe, they're in China. The data centers have to be hooked up to the satellites and to the drones and to other surveillance types of mechanisms and to AI weapons enabled systems. All of this information that guides or that is collected by these individual devices has to feed back into a data center and be processed by an AI program, which will then instruct that device to do, go out and find some more information about this, or shoot that guy over here, or drop this bomb over here, or let's go nuclear, or what the heck. So the data centers, the third article that I wrote about that is that well, that's the second article. That World War III is going to World War IV, if you want to, it seems like World War III has already been going on. World War IV is going to take place inside the data centers because, Amazon Web Services and Oracle and others, they have data centers, some in the United States, but they also have them in China. So the day after he was inaugurated the second time, Trump had Sam Altman and Larry Ellison and these other Silicon Valley oligarchs into the White House to announce this Stargate data center investment plan, because we want to make sure that all of our military applications that are running take place inside the continental United States, right? So that they can't be hacked by our enemies, which is not true. They can be. And it's going to be financed, by the way, by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and all these people that just coincidentally have business arrangements with Eric Trump and the Kushner brothers and others. So there's a vast amount of corruption involved in that. But the main thing about the data centers is that Amazon Web they connect to each other. So Amazon Web Services might have a data center in Northern Virginia, which they have a number of them there, that actually is connected via satellite or actually through cables, if you were, to the data centers in China, which are also used by the Chinese. So literally, you could have, until it was shut down, a war between China and the United States taking place, as it were, inside the same data centers, which makes those data centers ground zero. So the first thing that you do in a hot war is you blow up the other side's data centers, which is a problem because some of those data centers are ones that you're using yourself. The other thing that is being contemplated is you have to blind the enemy's satellites, which would most normally be done by unleashing a nuclear weapon in the orbital zone, which would fry the electronics of China's satellites or Russia's satellites, as it were. But it would also fry the electronics of America's satellites. So then everybody is blind.
Yeah.
And the next thing they do is they start throwing nukes at each other because of the uncertainties involved.
Right. I mean, this to me is what's most obvious to me about this, because I have a very grim assessment of the U.S. regime and what its aims are, which are essentially lawless global dominance for the aggrandizement of an oligarchy of corporate wealth that would like to maintain its position of dominance over the rest of the world as much as possible forever. And that this is insane, and that it's kind of running. It's pretty clear that the rest of the world is fed up to it, and that this empire has a shelf life, and that it's approaching it, if it's not already past it. And, we may be like Wile E. Coyote in a sense, just, hovering over in midair, having run off a cliff, and we just don't really know it yet. And right. And I feel like this is in a way what's happened, because our society is so dysfunctional in most every way, except for the fact of like just coasting on the power and wealth we've already accumulated. I mean, beyond that, we don't get the most out of our population intellectually and so on. And it seems that the love for AI, or the fetish of AI for these people who are essentially fascists. I mean, they're a really kind of contemptible, viscerally unappealing set of fascists, people like Peter Thiel and Alex Karp. But really, their hope is that they can forestall the democracy and the natural dialectical forces which are bringing down the empire, that, like, because they are losing on the normal human political field of battle, historically speaking, the AI might save them. Do you feel like that is a good assessment of what these guys are all about? Because they just seem like fascists who think that this is going to be the panacea for all the problems that they're facing, and the fact that this system is just illegitimate and kind of crumbling as we speak.
Well, the commonality that all those have economically is that they don't want to pay taxes. I mean, they're multi-billionaires. They have ungodly amounts of wealth.
And they don't want anything in the public realm. They want everything to be privatized and everything to be a realm for rent seeking.
Well, if you look at Palantir, which was created by Peter Thiel in 2002 with an investment from the CIA through its InQtel investment arm, and then it was brought along with contracts from the CIA and Homeland Security and top secret surveillance stuff that it's been doing ever since. It went public in 2020, and so finally we were able to see into how it works a little bit. And they never paid any taxes. What their operating model was to operate a deficit so that they could say that they were running at a loss and not pay any taxes. And then they would go back to their investors and say, oh, give us some more money. So they would just, and people were, banks and Silicon Valley venture capitalists, just throwing billions and billions of dollars at Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, who is a genuine fascist, as is Thiel. I mean, these guys, Thiel has written books, and so has Karp, in which they basically say that democracy needs to be superseded, that women shouldn't be able to vote, and that America, in particular Silicon Valley, needs to be able to go wherever it wants to go in the world, not pay any taxes, and suck in as much profit as possible. So it's no surprise that Thiel names all of his companies after motifs in The Lord of the Rings.
I mean, it's so pathetic and dorky, like this is what kind of society elevates clowns like these. I'll tell you
so
what disturbing to me.
Does this, Aaron? It's a society that's uploaded its brain to the internet. I mean, science fiction used to write about, we'll get to the point where individual brain can be encoded and put into a computer, and then your body will die and you can keep alive and keep on going, But what's actually happened is that our brains have been uploaded into the internet, as it were, which then people spend ungodly amounts of hours every day staring at the screens, or like we're doing right now. And the internet is actually recording everything that goes on, as it were, and using it as training data, as it were, to get people to keep doing this, to keep staring at the screens and being influenced. I mean, look what's going on in Los Angeles over the weekend. I read The Guardian today. There's an article about a woman who was walking down the street, and I guess there was a curfew. She was trying to get to her house. She'd gone to the grocery store, and the cops just came up and shot her with a non-lethal round. There was a bystander with a camera who went running over, and the cops chased them both down the street. I mean, so that appeared in The Guardian, and it had a link to the cell phone footage of it. But at the same time, there's like millions of artificial AI generated lies going on about what's going on there. And depending on what vendor you like to look at, Fox so-called news or MSNBC so-called news or ABC so-called news or CBS or the New York Times or whatever, you may or may not find out about I haven't seen anybody else writing about the woman that got shot, only The Guardian. But the Fox News is just one endless stream of looters dedicated to overthrowing the government, insurrection, blah blah blah, just magnifying this increasing fascist clampdown because it's profitable. And they've got all of us like looking for the latest update. What's going on in Los Angeles? What's going to go on this weekend with Trump's birthday martial parade, right? So what we need to do, in my opinion, is disconnect. We need to go on strike and just say, okay, I'm not going to do frickin' internet media. I'm not going to look at my screen for a week, see how that goes. I've got I get a subscription to the Financial Times. It comes in paper every day, right? It's got really small print. It's really hard to read, but because they want to save money. But nonetheless, that's where the ruling class talks about the actual financial issues that it's concerned with, and the news is pretty good. I mean, if you get into it, the politics is something else. But even the Financial Times is all freaked out about what's going on in America and with Trump. I mean, because he's messing with the global economy, and it's very anarchic, and it doesn't really seem to have much of a plan except this kind of inchoate tapping into fears that certain Americans have, the mantra is that we offshored all the manufacturing jobs, or a lot of the manufacturing jobs, and therefore the white working class is all upset. Well, actually, there's still plenty of manufacturing jobs in America. A lot of people that did lose their manufacturing jobs to Vietnam or China or wherever transitioned into services and finances. Maybe they made a little less money because unions used to be good, but now there's hardly any unions. So, yeah, there's a segment of the population that's definitely been negatively affected, while a very small segment, has done really well. But what you get down here to in terms of international relations, I think it has a lot to do with debt. I mean, the United States is really over leveraged.
And the philosophy of debt is so stupid in the West. I mean, it's the dumbest thing in the world if you were looking at this like from aliens from outer space, and the world's like, oh, we're so screwed, we have so much debt. But it's like, well, who do you owe it to? Do you owe it to another planet and they're shaking you down? No. You could erase as much debt as you wanted to. Like, we should have massive debt write-downs in ways that sensibly restructure this whole system. But it's like because of, I think, the logic of capitalism, debt is considered like a sacrosanct principle. It's like, so we subject poor countries to like these terrible draconian punishments because we pretend it's some sort of moral obligation to repay your debts. But the logic of compound interest is twisted and harmful to society, and it'll wreck societies if you let it. And because these people have the most power, they've enshrined that as this like sacred ideal. It's just another example of they can't fix any problem because they won't let themselves actually look at their system objectively and how it's a failure in any human sense.
Well, and enter the bond market. I mean, with the United States under the Trump regime withdrawing, as it were, from Europe in terms of financing their military, to some extent withdrawing. We'll see what happens. The European governments, all of them run by banking interests, are saying, oh, now we have to spend more than 5% of our gross national product on military.
Right.
This has been like the whole mantra.
And they can't win. They can't beat anybody. What are they? It's such a joke. The Ukraine thing is such a joke. Like they're going to go and fight Russia. They're going to send in the Belgian chocolatiers, and they're going to really give them what for. I mean, it is such a joke that the idea that Europe is going to become this military superpower.
It's not a joke to the stock market, though, because Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and the rest of them and the banks that support them are doing very fine off of these wars. Israel just sold like $5 billion worth of bonds in the Western markets to finance this $70 billion U.S. assisted genocide, right?
Yeah.
So war. Here's the problem: most of this debt is for military purposes.
Well, the deficit in the U.S. is pretty much military.
So I mean, how much logic does it take to make the correlation between people's living standards and the over leveraging of military spending? And the horror of that actually is that they actually need wars to keep it going, because without some actual wars to spend the products that they've already been stockpiling, then they won't need any more new products, right? So now you've got Peter Thiel and the rest of them. They're coming in tailing after the big primes, Lockheed and the other four that are the concentrations of the 55 weapons manufacturers that existed after World War III. Now it's only 5. Lockheed gets more U.S. federal dollars than any other entity, and Palantir and Anduril, which are Thiel's companies that are getting a lot of attention these days, finally, which is good. Like Glenn Greenwald is looking at it, and others. These companies the leaders are going around blowing these horns of war against China. We need to destroy China's industrial base because they have AI, and if we don't destroy their industrial base, then we're all going to end up speaking Chinese. This is just like frickin' hype to get people to approve giving more contracts to Palantir and Anduril. Palantir and Anduril are both now have a market value greater than Lockheed.
Right.
And it's fictitious capital. It's bound to fail and fall, eventually, because their products are not like industrial machines. They're not creating value. They're only destroying value.
Right.
So this is the problem. That what was it? Some Vance or one of these idiots the other day, is saying, China, you need to stop overproducing and you need to start consuming. Right. Well, that's
what they're doing anyway. They've boosted consumption enormously.
Overproduction is the Achilles heel of capitalism. They overproduce, and then the way of extracting value, which only comes from human labor, disappears. So then they go to war to destroy the machinery that has been producing value on the other side of the river or the other side of the ocean, so they can rebuild. It's this continual cycle of destruction and rebuilding, all based on pumping up the flow of capital to increasingly fewer and fewer people. I mean, when you read Marx's Capital, although things have changed somewhat in the last 150 years, the basic paradigm is correct. I mean, profit comes from labor, and war comes from the inability of capital to keep increasing.
Right. I mean, it's the way capitalism is this sort of mafia imperialist system. If you just look back at it, it was essentially mafia groups that enclosed the commons, and they totally produced a shock in English society by kicking people off the land so that they could have their capitalist enterprise, the textile industry, the raising sheep instead of letting people farm on the land. And the result of it was that they had to go over to Ireland and start expropriating and killing everybody there and stealing all their stuff to set up farms and for export of beef and crops and so on. And it results in a couple centuries later in the potato famine. But that still wasn't enough. They had to go to the U.S. and just expand. And that was to set up tobacco plantations initially, and then the slave trade and so on. And Western expansion, and then the Spanish-American War. It's always had to expand and it's essentially like a mafia whose turf just gets bigger and bigger. It's kind of illegitimate from the beginning to have a property rights regime like this imposed, and it's antithetical to democracy. And that kind of gets at what these guys are. It's still a fundamental issue of what they're dealing with today. When you look at these guys like Thiel, who, as you note, says he's an anti-democracy activist, and then there are these quotes from Alex Karp where he's saying China is the antithesis of Western values and the U.S. is the least discriminatory, or the least discriminatory people in the world. And also that Karp said that social change, I don't know if you heard this, but this was mentioned, it might have been in yours, but also in the recent Greenwald article on it, where he was saying social change comes from sticking it to your enemies and making them poor so they can't defeat you. I mean, that's such a clearly fascist thing. It's not about democracy at all. It's about, you don't have a fair fight with people. You destroy them, you destroy their bank accounts, you win politically because you have all of this power. It's so blatantly fascistic. And that seems to be the essence of capitalism, really, when it comes down to it.
Well, they recognize the truth that a lot of people don't. We don't live in a democracy. We live in a plutocracy. This is not a democracy. A democracy would actually have genuine input from below, and there would be an egalitarian thrust. We have the opposite of that. You know, it's very interesting. You mentioned the word enclosure and the word textiles. I mean, it's like the new textiles is the AI military industrial complex, because, you know, AI has two functions in my view. One is social, which is to keep people pacified and confused and incapable of actually figuring out what's actually going on in the world outside of their computer paradigm. And the other thing is that the profit to be made from it really is from weapons, because you've got this huge sugar daddy, which is not just the United States government, but governments all over the world, India and Pakistan, China, the Europeans, not so much in South America, thank goodness, are all lining up to buy not only autonomous weapons, which are just proliferating, underwater submarines, airplanes, tanks, but the AI programs that can theoretically control them. And, you know, it's a problem because it won't work. It doesn't mean that people won't be dying. It doesn't mean that we might not, we might have a nuclear resolution. But the American public, I believe, needs to be educated about what AI really is, and also about, what capitalism really is and what democracy really is.
Yeah, right. But they don't want, that's the main thing that they don't want people to think about at all. It seems
Right.
to be everything is geared towards keeping people from actually just asking kind of obvious questions like, would we benefit more or less from having the oil industry nationalized? Or if we nationalize the healthcare crime syndicate, or the health insurance crime syndicate that presides over us all, like having an honest debate about that is the one thing they want to preclude the most.
I was thinking yesterday about this. Something that people are probably aware of is that with the neural nets, with the chats, they are black boxes, which means that, unlike with what was earlier talking about with rules-based, algorithmic, type of computation and early AI, that you could track the input and then see what was being done to it inside the computer in terms of creating the output. You could track it because it's all rules-based, and there's a record of it you could print out, as it were. You can't do that with the neural nets because there's literally billions and billions of these little cells, as it were, in which data is going into, and then depending on the data that's exists in the cells next to it is being probabilistically directed to one or another adjacent cells and this happens billions and billions of times a second until a word comes out or a cat's paw comes out. So people talk about, especially in military circles, well, we don't want to put everything on an AI until we understand what's going on inside the black box, until we have explainable AI, right? And I was thinking, well, that's so crocked because, first of all, the AI is trained on human culture. The AI is not assessing data to inform its worldview that is coming from anywhere but the internet and whatever narrow AI databases are inserted into it, whether it's like breast cancer database or target consumer database or figures on how many drone attacks have succeeded or not succeeded in the Ukraine. So we're asking and hoping that AIs will give us the possibility of being able to explain themselves, how they got from the question to the answer. Well, now let's think about human beings. Can we explain ourselves? Can we explain our society? I mean, we're like programmed, we have this like Stone Age mentalities hormonally and neurologically that's trying to cope with these like 21st century weapons. We're programmed to make binary solutions, fight or flight, good or bad. Now, this isn't really going to work in a complex adaptive system, which is reality, in which there is never one single cause of anything. When people talk about Israel and Palestine, for example, they say, "Oh, well, the Israelis got to go quash the Palestinians because they crossed this fence a couple years ago and murdered a bunch of people that were having a rave in a kibbutz." Right? Can you believe they were having a rave right next to a concentration camp? Good for them. That isn't actually the cause of what happened. It isn't why the people that went through the fence and murdered about half of the people that are supposedly claimed to have been murdered. The other half were murdered by the IDF. We know that pretty well. That isn't the cause of what's going on in Gaza right now, of the genocide. The cause is goes back. It's unraveling. It's like turtles all the way down, right? So to expect an AI to be explainable is quixotic as being able to expect humans to be able to explain why they do anything in a causal sense,
right,
that goes beyond just like a binary choice.
Well, and if they're looking at publicly available sources of information, that are readily accessible to them, how can they account for the distorting effects of power and hegemony over the actual discourse in the first place? Because Americans, if you're going by what the majority or bulk of Americans say, they are informed by their cosmology is informed by institutions that are designed to to stupefy them on behalf of powerful people and to get them to accept ideas that are really antithetical to their interests, and they are kept ignorant of fundamental facts about their condition and about their history and about the potential for the future. And so you're basically training these computers in this artificial intelligence to acquire what they would call the intelligence by listening to the most brainwashed and kind of stupefied mass public. And so it really is garbage in, garbage out, and it all, if you just stop and think about it, it says the garbage comes from the top. And this is why everything sucks and is getting worse. But then there's this, somehow AI is going to save them, or it's this great solution. I mean, have you ever heard Henry Wallace, or if you've ever looked back at Henry Wallace, he was saying, Roosevelt's vice presidential candidate, he was saying in the 30s, we've solved all the technical production problems of society to take care of everyone's material needs. Mm-hmm. This was in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And now we're saying AI is going to do all these great things. And well, what is it going to do? Is it going to solve all of our material needs? Oh, well, we don't want to do that. It's going to do these other things that are great. Well, how is it that if these things were solvable in the 30s, we still haven't solved them? What is AI even supposed to solve? Well,
the problem, of course, is that in the beginning, the last couple of years, a lot of corporations started to lay off people and hire OpenAI and other providers to come in and take over the jobs with AI agents, as it were. And now that they're finding that it doesn't work, because there's no intuition involved in that. There's nothing other than just a very kind of anarchic, probabilistic impersonation of human rationality.
Of American human rationality, which is even worse.
Well, the whole thing about rationality is that it's really overhyped. I mean, Robert Sapolsky and Kahneman and Tversky and many others in evolutionary biologists, neuroscientists have been telling us for years that rationality is just the excuse that we make to explain what it is we already did. Because we make decisions at a really visceral level, which is problematic, because you've got like millions of Americans deciding to vote for Trump or to Harris or whatever because they like them better, right? Not because of anything to do with politics or policy or.
To be fair, the biggest issues of the day are so ignored or lied about that. I'm more sympathetic to like people who would vote for Trump after what Biden did in his 4 years in office, to where I'm like, it's not like I would say vote for Trump ever, but it's like, how much crazier is it than like Joe Biden when this other party is demented, has this Ukraine war that was doomed and came from a U.S. overthrow in the first place, and then genocide is going on, and they're just like, this isn't happening. That's not a genocide. We're going to keep sending them money. Everything's fine. I mean, this is like, I'm sympathetic to this in a sense. What do you do? What do you do when there's nothing you can do? That's the question.
Stop the genocide in Gaza with one phone call.
Yeah,
but he did the opposite, And then Trump came in and pulled the wool over everybody's eyes and got a little ceasefire, and now it's even worse, right? This is an American project. The genocide is an American project. Israel is an American project.
This is a key question, and it gets kind of beyond the scope of your articles. But I would say that what is the source of American foreign policy? What are the domestic sources of U.S. foreign policy? Is it a monolith, or is it a kind of oligarchic system with different forces that clash? I think that Zionism became more powerful as a force in U.S. society for complicated reasons, and one way to track this is 1956 Suez Crisis. Eisenhower, Standard Oil guy, he said, "No, Israel, you can't do this. This is crazy. This will destroy our image. It's better for us to have good relations with the Arabs, make them our client states, not just go around slaughtering Arabs and stealing their land, and so on." But then, years later, after the Kennedy assassination, you get JFK or LBJ in there, and he's a total, loyal to Israel. He doesn't even object to them attacking the USS Liberty in 1967, and they acquiesced to the 67 war. Total reversal.
That was Johnson.
That was Johnson. So between LBJ and Eisenhower, you had a total shift. And so the reasons for the political constituency of LBJ, which I'd say is Teamster, kind of Lansky, syndicate corrupted forces, whereas the Republicans were more waspy, Standard Oil. And so there was a difference there, and these Zionist people won, and so now this is the U.S. policy, but it's not really in the national interest. It doesn't even make sense if you're just an evil American imperialist, but you're actually an American imperialist, then you're thinking like this, because it's destroying the U.S. empire. Look at the 21st century wars for Israel, Iraq, and so on, and Syria and Libya. These have just helped to hasten the end of the U.S. empire.
Well, people that make these kinds of policies don't really think that far ahead. They basically just operate on short-term profits, and they have no moral stances generally. But with Israel, in my opinion, it serves two purposes for American empire. One is to provide a military base for subjugating the oil countries, as it were. But the other is that it has this amazing military-industrial complex. What people don't understand usually is that firms like Elbit Systems, ELBIT, which is like kind of the Lockheed Martin of Israel, actually has partnerships with Lockheed Martin here. Most of these Israeli military and also AI surveillance app designing firms have multiple partnerships with American companies that are receiving Pentagon funds, and not to mention police departments all over. So, in a way, Israel kind of infiltrated over the last 40 or so years the American military and the police apparatus here.
The intelligence apparatus as well. If you look at James Angleton, especially, it's they have more dirt on us than.
Well, plus they have a lot of money to throw into politicians, and you could buy a politician in America, and then you've got the Republican Party, which actually is a lot smarter than the Democratic Party. They spent a long time thinking this through and gerrymandered all his congressional districts so they can get these immoral fucking clowns into office, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the rest of them. There isn't a single member of Congress, with the possible exception of Byrne, although I don't know about that I would cross the street to save from a bus that was bearing down and then was going to crush them into little pieces. I mean, the entire thing is a corrupt institution that is utterly incapable of doing anything to turn the situation that we are in around right now. And, AI just makes it worse because AI is being used to create massive amounts of propaganda that is targeting the American mind through these horrible telecom ventures. I'm going to tell you that one of the things that the Apple and the rest of them have been saying in the past few months is that, we recognize that there's a problem with hallucinations. So we've developed a new programmatic approach called reasoning, where we can now get our large language models to go back and explain, like what I was talking about before, how we got to where we are. Well, there's a paper that just came out a couple of days ago, and it's written by Apple scientists, right? It's called The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. I'll read you one sentence. This sums up the whole thing. It says, through extensive experimentation across diverse puzzles, we show that frontier large language models face a complete accuracy collapse beyond certain complexities.
Yeah.
A complete accuracy collapse. So it's not just that they are confused or they confabulate or they hallucinate about certain things about 20% of the time normally, but the larger you make them, contrary to Silicon Valley's claim that the more data you give it, the more accurate it's going to be, actually the larger you make them, the worse it's going to be.
Yeah.
So the good news is that AI is going to collapse. I mean, we've been through 5 AI winners in the last 70 years. There's going to be another one. It's like tulip mania. These companies have so much money invested in it. They're throwing good money after bad. Meta, so-called Facebook, Zuckerberg just basically bought Scale AI because Scale AI vacuums data up from around the world, narrow data sets that I'm talking about, cleans it up using humans to go in and label the cat's paw and the words and stuff like that are paid sub wages, and they all live in third world countries, as it were. They just basically put billions and billions of dollars into Scale AI, which is a horrible military-oriented startup, because their models are failing. Their Llama model is failing. OpenAI is on the verge of collapse. I predict that it's going to be eaten by Microsoft any day, because Microsoft already owns a good deal of it. But Microsoft has the databases on which OpenAI has to run all of its inferences. You can't ask a chat a question without actually having a Microsoft database be the venue of the vector of the answer. So that's why they're just trying to suck in all these billions and billions of dollars from these corrupt regimes in the Middle East, which are doing it because they want the databases to be in their countries because they have military applications. They don't care about your ChatGPT. They care about the military applications and being able to run their local wars using databases that they can secure, right?
Well, and just sort of counterinsurgency political warfare on their own populations, which is their main task, right? To surveil their populations and have a kind of panopticon in effect that's hoovering everything up. And,
the greatest lie that it came down the pike in the last 20 years, was back in 2011, Twitter is going to democratize the world, right? Look what happened.
Oh, yeah, that was fake then, though. When I saw those Libyan Twitter accounts, and I was in graduate school, but I was already a big critic of U.S. imperialism. I was in graduate school basically because I already had my dissertation thesis basically worked out that the U.S. is a lawless gangster empire bent on global dominance. And so when I saw those things in Libya, I'm like, there's no way that this is an organic phenomenon, that all these Libyans are taking to Twitter for freedom and so on. Those had to be sock puppet accounts and so on, because it wasn't even that big in the U.S. back then. But then somehow these Libyans are on the cutting edge of it, and it just is so perfect for U.S. interests. It was a U.S. telecom company, and now we know that these are basically arms of the national security state. So yeah, it was all bullshit from the beginning.
Yeah, I have an anecdote about that. Some years ago, I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is kind of the spy college for the Navy and other military forces. As a reporter, I get to go to these places, right? And they were showing me these programs that they had that Twitter had given them millions of pounds of data, as it were, on Libya and elsewhere, and in ISIS. And basically, it was going through, analyzing the Twitter comments, not only to figure out who was saying what and where they were, but where the sentiment was. And it started out that most of the comments that were being made by people using Twitter accounts in Syria and elsewhere during these various uprisings were targeting local institutions that they didn't like, local governments, the local mayor, the local imam, whatever. But as the Twitter universe exploded, they started targeting America, because the more knowledge that they got through the little tweets and stuff, they started looking for causation, and they increasingly focused on America. It was very interesting. So the military, of course, was quite keen on developing that, and now I'm sure it's done on steroids, because if you monitor social media, you can tell what's going on. So that's why most of the intelligence that the 17 intelligence agencies that we have in this country are looking at is open source now. It used to be 80% covert and 20% open source, like newspapers and TV shows. Now it's the reverse. You don't need.
It's going to be weirder if what is sort of predictable happens, which is that they're going to have more bots flooding the space with fake politics, fake political ideas. You could get if you're saying like we are gauging the public will by looking at what's on social media, but then other parts of their own ridiculous, intelligence community are flooding it with like, NAFO, like the North Atlantic Fellas Organization, those stupid ass dog accounts where they have the little cutesy puppy avatars, and they're just like the dumbest, most mindless idiots for the Ukraine war. But they were just like, they would show up en masse. You know what I mean? Like, so they're going to be they're just going to be getting high on their own supply potentially, and wrong there too.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting article. Sometimes the New York Times doesn't do everything bad. They never saw a war they didn't like, but some of the reporters there are pretty good. And there's an article a day or two ago about the election in Romania that was interfered with by Russia. It's pretty good. It's pretty clear that the Russians very cleverly went in and influenced that election to their own interests very profoundly, And we all know that the United States does it too. The New York Times isn't writing about it. But
they made up the Russiagate thing, so I'd always be skeptical, and they've never really said, they never got to the bottom of that, and it apparently goes.
Thing, the Russians actually were doing stuff. It just turned out it wasn't that influential.
Well, and that they knew it from the beginning that it wasn't, and that there was a lot of, and that the stuff about Hillary's emails there was never any evidence for it. Well, they admitted that. They eventually admitted that, which is actually, and then they kept that secret for like 2 years.
Well, the Democrats used the whole Russiagate thing as an excuse to deflect from the actual fact that Hillary Clinton was a monster that nobody wanted to vote for, some people did. But
and the neocons used it to make sure that there was no rapprochement with Russia.
Well, that's why the Democrats are completely sterile eunuchs right now. They have no idea about how to respond whatsoever, because they've been doing the same shit forever, right? I mean, Gavin Newsom had his speech last night. I've been covering Gavin since he was a supervisor, 25 years ago, and I have zero regard for Gavin Newsom. He's a creature of Gordon Getty and the bourgeoisie. But the speech he did last night was actually pretty interesting because it's the first Democrat to actually stand up and say the emperor has no clothes. The first one that I'm aware of. I guess that AOC and Byrne have been doing it in their own way, but this was a mainstream centrist, leaning to the right, increasingly because he wants to be president, Gavin Newsom, right? And I have to say that watching his little presentation, I was kind of impressed only in that there's part of me that wants to treat a lot of this as farcical because it is farcical because, there's no insurrection in Los Angeles. I wish there was, but there is no insurrection in Los Angeles. The dangers that Trump and Hegseth and the rest are pointing to are non-existent, right? But they're creating the condition where they suddenly become excuses for a clampdown that has now freaked out Gavin Newsom. So if it freaks out Gavin Newsom, then I'm getting freaked out too, because that's actually important.
Right, and it also raises the question of how long can the Democrats continue to not even make attempts to win elections by appealing to the people's actual interests, I mean, that they're...
Yeah.
Because it's so clear that they are dominated by moneyed interests whose entire reason for being active in politics is to continue persuading both parties to ignore the public interest and allow them to keep screwing the public. Like this is both of our party's principles. This is so, and it was one thing you could do this when the U.S. was so powerful that they could determine outcomes on the global stage more often than not and kind of tell the world how it's going to be. But now we're in this stage where that isn't the case anymore. And they seem to think AI is going to help them, but I don't think that will.
Trump used to be a Democrat. Elon Musk was a Democrat less than a year ago, right? They have no ideology except the Peter Thiel kind of ideology, which they all really share, which is that Curtis Yarvin type of stuff, where they can have these states within states. They're trying to set up a special town now in California, out near between San Francisco and Sacramento. They bought all this land, Sequoia Capital and others, where they want to create a new city, right? But it's a city only for Silicon Valley use, and they want is a kernel of what they call a foundation network state, where they don't have to pay any taxes.
What are they going to call it? Like Minas Tirith or something absurd like that, and then build a replica of the White Tower.
Yeah, it'd be something out of Lord of the Rings. A lot of people are puzzled by why this monster would name his stuff after the Lord of the Rings. I'll tell you why. Palantir is named after the Seeing Stone in the Lord of the Rings, which the evil Lord, Dark Lord Sauron, used to find his enemies and then destroy them.
Not just find them, but to manipulate their minds. I mean, he in particular manipulated the minds of the steward. I mean, this is very nerdy shit to get into, but manipulated the minds of the steward of Gondor and so on. So it wasn't merely a sort of a window for a kind of like panopticon thing. It was also like a way to manipulate their perceptions of reality. And the fact that you would like that idea just evinces such a creepiness. And then, but then they also mix it with the worst parts of Tolkien, which are his sort of allegories of like the Great White West as like this wonderful force. I mean, it just is so pathetic and horrible.
Well, this movie is like made me vomit. They're just like endless close-ups of these blonde white hobbits and white witches and stuff. I mean, it was,
it's suitable as a European kind of mythology, but it also it's that part of it is where I appreciate it and both recognize the limitations of it. The dude is white and has so much latent unacknowledged racism that it's comical, but it speaks to certain mythological themes that are cool. It's just that it would be cooler if the West and the whiteness wasn't so obviously the driving force of all the bad shit in the world for so long, then you could look at it in a more dispassionate way. Now, if you fetishize it, it's just kind of sick.
Tolkien was writing in a time when the Bolshevik Revolution was a threat to the middle class way of life in England.
Yeah,
hence the hobbits are going to save us. Well, I got bad news for America. We don't have any like middle class hobbits that are like willing to go out and take on the Dark Lord here, apparently, or do we? I mean,
that was always the bullshit, though, because I always felt that in his own way, he wanted the Shire and the hobbits to represent in some way the English and the heart of the English, which wasn't imperialistic, but might be roused to action, like in the World Wars or something. Like he definitely, it would seem, has a real denial about imperialism and what England. I mean, England is pound for pound. England and Britain and Israel are worse than the U.S. The U.S. has been worse because they're so much more powerful, but that same sort of white fascist at the core mindset is there because capitalism, and America's the ultimate capitalist place.
When I saw those horrible Lord of the Ring movies, which God bless me, I did, I rooted for the orcs, I mean, it's like they were the working class from Russia is what they were actually in Tolkien's head. Or
Nazis. It's a little difficult to.
Well,
it wasn't straightforward, but there's definitely some sort of like they're from the east and the south.
Right. I mean, I chose to view them as actually the opposite of how they were being portrayed. It's like in the Harry Potter stuff. I mean, I'm actually in favor of Voldemort for a number of reasons, which would be another subject altogether. But taking down the British intellectual schooling system, I think would be a really good idea. And Harry Potter has all these magical skills, and he doesn't lift one finger to help any poor person. All he does is play these parlor tricks to ensure that his class stays on top.
Yeah, that's kind of a theme in pop culture and art and so on, is the sort of lack of a deeper awareness. But anyway, I'm going to. We've gone on for we're a little bit over time, but I really appreciate this conversation and your articles, which are available at projectcensored.com, and I will put links to them. The series is Military AI Watch. Do you have any other place besides this where people can follow your work?
Well, I have a website. You can Google me. I hate to say search engine me. Peter Byrne, BYRNE .info. And I've got 40 years worth of investigative journalism and science writing. I've written books. I've done all sorts of stuff that you can see on my website if you want, including articles I wrote 20 years ago about Gavin Newsom and Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna is not the progressive that you might think, or that he portrays himself as. And if you go to my website, you can read an article I wrote in 2004 that exposes Ro Khanna as a neocon.
They all seem to be crooks, don't they? When it comes down to it,
scum rises to the top. Scum rises to the top in America.
I mean, if they weren't, they wouldn't be able to get those positions. That's really the system that we have. If you're not inclined towards criminality, you will be weeded out of the system because we have a demeritocracy.
Yeah, we have a demeritocracy. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's going on forever. But.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was great talking to you, and I look forward to reading the rest of the series.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.